I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati.
All right. Welcome. Happy Thursday. Got a pretty exciting show tonight. Welcome to Sab's podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. If you are new, I want to let you know that Sab's podcast is a part of Revolutionary Blackout Network. You can catch me there on Tuesday, Thursday, and Fridays. And you can catch me here. I have a different day now. You can catch me here on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Sunday. So Sunday seems to be a better fit for me. So I have switched that Monday for that Sunday. So just giving you guys a heads up about that. Quick shout out to everyone watching on YouTube, Rockfin, and Twitter. We've got a lot to talk about tonight. I want to go ahead really quick before Camilla comes on and tell you what we're going to be discussing tonight. Should be a pretty interesting show. And of course, we are doing a call-in tonight after the show as well. So tonight, we are discussing Kshama Sawant. Huge announcement. She will be here. I found that out actually a couple hours ago. So Kshama will be here later on in the show to talk about that announcement. I'm also going to discuss Bernie Sanders' working class interview. We're going to talk about that. That is also related to the Kshama Sawant announcement. I'm also going to discuss California reparations. What is happening in California? They have a task force going there. We're going to get into that discussion with Camilla. And I'm also going to discuss Louisiana ballot initiative wins. Now, Louisiana has a lot, and I mean a lot of ballot initiatives. So I'm only going to do 3 tonight, and we'll just take them as they come each night, by the way. So that's what we're discussing tonight. And I believe Camilla is here. Camilla, just give me a thumbs up whenever you are ready. All right. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys. So my first special guest tonight is Camilla Moore. She's an attorney, and she is the chairperson for the California Reparations Task Force. So Camilla, thank you so much for coming on for this, I think, much needed discussion tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor, and I'm excited for the discussion.
All right. So first and foremost, I want you to explain to everyone, because I think we've talked about reparations before on the show, and there have been some misunderstandings about what reparations actually is. I think some people think it's just based on skin color, and it's not. Could you please explain to everyone a little bit about what reparations actually is and why we need to have that in this country?
Yes. So when I think about reparations, particularly in the context for the institution of slavery, the United States perpetuating the institution of slavery, including the transatlantic slave trade and the afterlife, or the badges and incidents of slavery, I tell people, I describe reparations for slavery and its badges and incidents as a sacred political project that actually started with the enslaved themselves. People, human beings like Belinda Sutton, Cali House, and Isaiah Dickerson, for instance. These were formerly enslaved people who mobilized, in the instance of Cali House and Isaiah Dickerson, created one of the largest grassroots and mutual aid organizations for the sole purpose of, helping the newly freed slaves, but also, lobbying the federal government for a pension or reparations for those nearly 4 million newly freed slaves in this country. And that is a debt that's owed, right? And so, the descendants of those slaves, African Americans, right, we are, carrying the torch to achieve, this sacred political project that started with our ancestors. So yes, reparations not only acknowledges the debt that's owed to our ancestors for over 250 years of free labor, but it's also to account for the governments from federal, state to local governments complicity in perpetuating the badges and incidents of slavery that still linger on and impact slave descendants.
That's right. So I want to go ahead and share this about the California Reparations Task Force, because you guys are doing like really great work there. I mean, they just announced that there's going to be a reparations task force in Boston as well. So I think your efforts in California has gotten the message going to other states to consider to start doing this as well. But it says California is the first state in the nation to implement legislation that mandates the study and development of reparation proposal for African Americans, with a special consideration of African American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. So in reference to the task force, so to speak, because I don't want people to get confused. Mm-hmm. This is basically a project, or the task force, so to speak, is basically to fight for it, to push for it, but you guys can't actually sign anything into law.
Right. So the California Reparations Task Force, we're an official state boarding commission. We are a legislative advisory body. So you're completely correct. We do not have the power to, turn our final proposals into law. So we definitely don't have the power to enact any legislation into law. We are 9 members, volunteers, California citizens who were appointed to the State Boarding Commission because of our different areas of expertise and interest to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. It'll be up to the California State Legislature when we turn in our final report to them in June 30th, 2023, to turn our final proposals into actual legislation. And then it'll be up to either the governor of the state to sign our legislation into law, or depending on the proposals, some of these proposals will end up on the California ballot.
And it says here, the task force scope and powers as a legislative advisory body are predicted on AB-3121, a statute authored by the California Secretary of State, Shirley Weber, and signed into law by California Governor Gavin Newsom in September 2020. So you guys have been working on this for a while.
Yes, we had our first hearing June 2021. We're a 2-year effort. And so the task force sunsets in the next 6 months or so, June 30th of 2023.
Awesome. Expert witnesses for the September hearing included Beth Gorman, who is a grandmother of poet Amanda Gorman. If you guys remember, she was the young woman that read the poem during President Biden's inauguration. Isabel Wilkerson, who is the author of Caste, See Oprah's Book Club, and Warmth of Other Suns, first Black American woman to win the Pulitzer Prize in journalism. John A. Powell, UC Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute, an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. And Douglas Blackman, American writer, 2009 Pulitzer Prize winner for his book entitled Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. Now, one of the questions that does tend to come up about this happening on the state level, it seems like to me, this may be done faster on the local level than the national level. But I do understand also that by trying to implement this in California, that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to have reparations on the national level, correct?
Yes. And the statute that the California Reparations Task Force is based on, AB 3121, there's a provision that states, in the event that California actually meets out reparations to African Americans, that does not preempt preempt the federal government's role. So the federal government still has the responsibility to pay reparations to African Americans on the federal level. And many reparationists in the reparation space still maintain that reparations is first and foremost a federal responsibility. And so, in the event that these different reparations task forces and committees are popping up across the local and state level, the argument is that, they could be helpful, particularly in the push for federal reparations. Other than that, it can get a little messy. As you see, all these different committees are having all these different kind of, so.
I know that Evanston, Illinois had announced some type of reparations that they had planned as well. But as I looked further into it, it seemed like that was more like a housing initiative per se. But for those who are not aware, this was recently announced. I don't know how many people know about this. But speaking of California, San Francisco has a reparation panel that is pitching $5 million each to Black residents. Camilla, I want to get your take on this, because I know I said this to you and I was like, I don't know if you've seen this, but how do you feel about this? What San Francisco is proposing?
I'm still looking into it. They submitted a draft report in December, actually, but it's just now kind of hitting the news. And so San Francisco, the African American Reparations Advisory Committee, has until June to actually finalize their proposal. So no, I'm just going to wait and see. But it's very interesting. I'm starting to kind of realize what many experts in the reparation space, particularly Dr. Darity, is saying in terms of sometimes these different, city, municipal efforts can kind of be a distraction towards the real prize, which is the federal goal. But that's not to say that, states and localities and municipalities cannot atone for any particular specific state or local sanctioned atrocities against the African American community. I think there's definitely space for that, which is why the California Reparations Task Force exists.
Correct. They say here a lump sum payment would compensate the affected population and will redress the economic and opportunity losses that Black San Franciscans have endured collectively as the result of both intentional decisions and unintended harms perpetuated by city policy. So this is another thing I wanted to talk to you about too, because a lot of times when we mention reparations, people think we're only referring to slavery. We're only referring to the 40 acres and a mule, but they don't think about the fact that Jim Crow is also a part of this as well. All of the laws that were imposed on Black people because of Jim Crow, that's also a part of it. I would also add in the crime bills that happened under Joe Biden. There's so much more that goes into this and not just slavery, but I wanted to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, and the way I frame it is that, slavery is absolutely the foundation. So, when we're talking about reparations, slavery is the foundation, right? Our ancestors were forced to labor in this country for 250 years. Not only, and this is, information that we revealed through our study, through our public hearings, right? Not only were our ancestors, traded like, commodities for their physical attributes, but a lot of people don't really understand that, we were actually traded for our intellectual abilities because our skills, right? Plantations were the mega corporations of their time, right? They capitalized on cash crops. They needed to get people who had the skills, cultivation skills, right? People were already cultivating to a certain extent rice and other crops on the coast of Africa, right? And so when we talk about slavery, right, that it was, the United States was built off, that institution, right? Built off of our ancestors. So that's definitely the foundation. But to your point, right, there are these in our historic 500-page interim report that we released in June, and you can find on our website, oag.ca.gov/AB3121. There's 13 chapters, right? The first chapter is an introduction. The second is a chapter on enslavement. But the remaining chapters we define as, the 12 major areas of, in layman's terms, systemic discrimination, but really 12 badges and incidents of slavery that still linger on and impact the African American community post-emancipation, post the broken promise of Reconstruction, like racial terror, like political disenfranchisement, like mass incarceration and over-policing, the pathologizing of the Black family, and on and on and on. And the last chapter, 13th chapter, is on the wealth gap. Currently, it'll take over 228 years to close the wealth gap between African Americans and white Americans in this country.
Yes. And there's a question that came up. Who would pay these reparations? Taxpayers? ? That's a good question. How would it pay? How would they pay for it, Camilla? At least California.
So interestingly enough, the task force, we are meeting again in San Diego next week. And we actually have invited some tax experts to come and provide expert testimony around issues around tax. So again, this interview is me speaking personally, not speaking on behalf of the task force. But if folks are kind of interested in that question, I would say stay tuned and either come to our meeting in person or watch virtually.
Well said. Thank you so much for that. I want to talk about net worth and wealth for a second, because I don't think people understand just how devastating the racial wealth gap is in the United States. And The Guardian actually recently put out an article that I think everyone really needs to pay attention to. Now, I was surprised this came from The Guardian, but they said the median wealth of Black Americans will fall to 0 by 2053. So see, this is the thing. I think sometimes people hear reparations are like, oh, well, Black people just want you to give them cash. Like, I don't understand that. First of all, there's a couple of things that go into this. After slavery, General Sherman did promise Black Americans 40 acres and a mule. That did not happen. This is why we don't have generational wealth for the most part in this country. Now, you may find some Black families that did have that, but for the most part, none. We weren't given that opportunity. After slavery, when there was, I think this during the period of Reconstruction, please correct me if I'm wrong, Camilla, but there was a time in this country where Black communities actually did have that. They were starting their own businesses in their own communities. So the dollar constantly turned in the Black community. Those were known as the Black Wall Streets. A lot of people know about Tulsa, but there were multiple Black Wall Streets. What happened to those communities? They were burned to the ground. So that was kind of like our chance there to have that. And all of those communities were burned down. But the fact that Black Americans' net worth by 2053 could be 0, this is very concerning.
Absolutely. And, that data is reflected in our interim report, the 13th chapter in the wealth gap. And yes, I heard recently, like in a podcast or something like that, or the top 1% now own like 2/3 of the wealth. So just think about like where African Americans who descend from slaves kind of situate in that, right? Like by 2053, and people say that that's actually we're on an accelerated timeline to that 0 wealth due to the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on our community. And so reparations is long overdue. And, I personally see the California Reparations Task Force is hopefully, setting a precedent and sending a signal or a message to the federal government that, reparations is far overdue. Interestingly enough, I'll just conclude by saying when we did publish our historic interim report June of last year, 2022, literally on the first day, I don't know which journalist, but a journalist actually asked Biden's press secretary during the official press conference if they had heard of the California Reparations Task Force, did they hear about this report that just came out? And so the federal government is aware of what the task force is doing. And so I think that's positive news. And hopefully, when we turn in that final report, that message is clear.
That's right. And for people who are not aware, I want to show this clip here. I've showed it on the show multiple times, but we have new viewers now. And I think people really need to see just how Black Americans were affected in this country. Now, this is called the unequal opportunity race. I just want to pause it here for a second to explain to people what's going on. The numbers that you see changing right here, those are the years going by. So as you can see, white Americans have already started the race and Black Americans are still waiting to start the race. Does everybody see that? That was generational wealth already being passed down. We haven't even made it to the 1900s yet. Being an educator, I have to pause here. Sorry, Camilla, and say this. Standardized tests are inherently racist and sexist. I'm sorry, I had to say that, Camilla.
No, I definitely are.
Yeah. And this is the end when it says affirmative action helps level the playing field. But affirmative action, as we know, can be a double-edged sword, right? It's like it can get you in the door, but then people can question whether or not you're really supposed to be there.
That's very true, too. I've learned they're going to question no matter what. Like, for instance, affirmative action has been banned in California since Proposition 209, so at least 20 years ago. So, but still people think that Black people get into Berkeley and UCLA because of affirmative action, or Stanford because of affirmative action, when it's been banned for over 20 years. So, I don't know. It's interesting.
That's right. There's a question here for you, Camilla. Thank you so much for the super chat. One Tall Girl. Discuss proposed repairs for the injustices to slaves and the associated descendant groups based on U.S. slave practices and policies that impacted state law, starting from the joining Cal State to the U.S. to present day.
Yeah, that's a pretty loaded question. I'm happy to do that. one tall girl. I'm also tall as well. So one of the there's a whole bunch of preliminary recommendations in our interim report that we released June 2022. One of them being the creation of the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, which would be an agency that would help to distribute reparations to the descendant community. Also, the task force has hired 5 people to serve on our economic consultant team to help the task force kind of ascertain what could potential compensation be for in the form of reparations for African Americans for particular state sanctioned atrocities or crimes, like California's role in housing discrimination and houselessness is one of the state sanctioned crimes that the economists identified. There's also mass incarceration and over policing is the second, right? Health harms is the third, and notably in the video you just showed, it showed how African Americans have a shortened lifespan. And so the economists, for instance, just to illustrate the point, right, gathered data and evidence to come up with a potential calculation for what African Americans are owed due to the life gap between African Americans and European Americans in this country. So health harms is the third. And then the fourth type of state-sanctioned atrocity that the economists are studying, trying to identify a potential calculation figure for is unjust property taken. So think about what happened with Bruce Beach, for instance, right? There's many instances of African Americans, their homes, their places of business, right, being disproportionately taken via a disproportionate use of eminent domain to our communities, highways and things like that. And then lastly, to conclude, the fifth state-sanctioned atrocity, the economists are working on trying to identify a number for potential compensation is devaluation of Black businesses. So I'll just say one last thing on this question because it's like a loaded question, but one of the mandates of the task force is to ensure that whatever our final recommendations are comport with international human rights law standards. And so I'm an attorney, I studied human rights law. And so under international law, there are 5 forms of reparations, right? Compensation or cash payments is one of those forms. And so that's why we hired those 5-member economic consultant team to help us identify what could reparations look like in the form of cash payments, right? And that's how they identified those 5 harms. But then also under international law, there is restitution. So that accounts for stolen land, stolen wealth, stolen labor, stolen property, real or even intellectual. Then there's also rehabilitation. So that could look like, free, medical care, health care, trauma services, mental health care. Satisfaction is a 4th form of reparations under international law. So that gets at more symbolic forms like, the renaming of streets or the taking down of Confederate monuments, things like that. And then lastly, the 5th form of reparations is guarantees of non-repetition, right? Cessation of the injury or the harm. So that gets into more conversations about structural institutional policy change. Since I'm in this forum, I'll even say things like abolition, for instance, right? That is a topic that is very closely related.
That's right. Camilla, I have actually 2 more questions for you. What's your take on the HR 40 bill that's been sitting in the House for years? Do you feel that goes far enough? Because I've heard Jim Clyburn talk about this. He said, of course, I'm for reparations. I interviewed Ro Khanna about this, and he said, well, yes, I agree with HR 40, but that bill has not been brought to the floor for a vote.
Yeah, right. You're right. I think they've reintroduced it for this, legislative session. It did not pass both chambers in the past. Well, since it's been introduced in the 80s. And, I'll just say AB 3121 is, based on HR 40. Much of the language is very, very similar, right? So if HR 40 passed, right, they would be doing work similar to what the task force is already doing. And so to that end, I generally, like, again, this is me speaking personally, not on behalf of the task force or anything. Like, I generally support, obviously, reparations legislation on the federal level. But at this point, because of the work that the task force is doing, I'm like, there could be some executive action at this point, right? Like, so I don't know.
100%. Michael, thank you for this super chat. Why not cash reparations immediately in California? Well, I think that's what San Francisco is looking to do right now. Michael, you might have came in later, but San Francisco, I know, announced that they're looking to pay like $5 million towards African Americans. But that's a good question. Camilla, I'll direct that to you.
Well, I mean, it is a good question. And for instance, in the preliminary recommendation to create a California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, like in this hypothetical agency, there would be like an office of immediate relief so that for those who are in immediate need can get their needs taken care of. But I think to the point you're making, the person who asked the question, there are some preliminary recommendations, again, in that interim report that the task force released June 2022. California state legislators, they have recently, got back into session. And so they're starting to, come up with their, legislation. And so, technically, they could figure out how to, incorporate some preliminary recommendations into their legislation, although, no preliminary recommendations related to cash were in the report. So I think maybe people are just kind of waiting to see what the task force comes up with in June of this year.
Okay, and here's another question from Danny. Thank you for the super chat. Should certain African nations also be obligated to contribute to reparations for their role in the transatlantic slave trade? That's an interesting question.
What do you think? What do you think? I'm curious.
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't so much like they had a choice. I think people should understand that. And then another question that comes up, kind of to go along with this, Prince Harry came out recently and said that, England should pay reparations to the Caribbean countries, right? Because they stole wealth from those countries and their role in the slave trade in those particular countries. So this goes along with another question people have asked me before, like, but what about people in Haiti and the Bahamas, all the other like Caribbean countries? Like, shouldn't they get reparations too? And you feel free to correct me on this, but my impression is that France would be the one to pay reparations to Haiti. And so England would be the one to pay reparations to the Bahamas, Barbados, as Prince Harry was saying. But I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I'll answer that part and then come back to the question. So Caribbean nations, they currently have a federation called CARICOM. And one of the dictates of CARICOM is to, lobby, their former colonial masters for reparations. So that federation has existed for some time now, and they're accelerating their efforts as well. And I think even partnering with the African Union in some instances as well. I believe the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, is the chair of the Reparations Commission for CARICOM. So they definitely have some great leadership. And I agree personally that, we all have our different claims. We all need to hold these European nations accountable for and America for their role. And so to your point, yes, Haitians, the claim is to France, Jamaica, the claim is to the Crown, and so forth and so forth. But to answer the question around African nations, like, I have a very brief but kind of complex response to that, right? I do not think that African nations as they exist today have the same responsibility as European nations as they exist today to reparations for descendants of slaves because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. Because the African nations that exist today, they did not exist during the slave trade, right? There were particular and specific African kingdoms, yes, that did have some role in trading human beings to the transatlantic slave trade. That is a historical fact. But for instance, Cameroon or Nigeria or Ghana as they exist today, these are nations based on, colonial dictates from the Berlin Conference of, the 1888, like that the way they're structured today, they had nothing to do with it, right? But I think, to the extent that, African kingdoms that still exist right today want to account in some way or another for their role, there is space for that. I think in the reparations space, if it's like truth and healing and reconciliation, we always think about that in the American context, but what does that look like in the context of Africans and African descendants? Something like that, I think could be fruitful. But also, I'll just conclude, I had a meeting recently with some activists from Namibia who reached out wanting to information share about their fight for reparations against Germany for the genocide that they experienced in 1903. And, one of the conversation points was, what are the expectations of the African Union potentially to the African American community when it comes to customs or trade, for instance, right? So, I think there is some willingness, I think, for the African Union to kind of be a part of the conversation and be like, okay, how can, we atone, or, nothing's wrong with that, having a conversation with African Americans about like, how can we kind of open up to you and acknowledgement of kind of like that, the past. But no, we cannot, that's dangerous territory to say, yeah, African nations owe, compensation and all these other things for their role in slavery. That's like a historical misnomer. The responsibility is to these European nations that exist now and existed then. So.
Yeah, and those nations also had the power. Thank you for the super chat, Lorez. Also, no Fed home loans in the 30s, no GI Bill for Black military. Yeah, that's another thing that comes up too, especially when we talk about the I was about to say the Green New Deal. When we talk about the New Deal, how I did a whole show about that, of how Black families were left out of certain parts of the New Deal as well. Redlining goes along with that also. And I want to get your take on this, Camilla, about economic universal programs. So a lot of the people that are watching came from the Bernie Sanders movement, not so much a part of that movement anymore. There's been a lot of disappointment that has gone that way. But one of the things that Bernie Sanders really advocated for was, if you give people these universal programs, then that'll lift everyone up out of poverty and we'll all be on a level playing field. But what we found over time is that the data shows and the research shows that that's not true for African Americans, because we're already behind our white peers. Even with those universal programs, we still won't be on the same level playing field as white Americans in this country. And I want to get your take about that. Like when people say universal health care and free pre-K, like I'm for all those things. But I want people to understand that still doesn't level the playing field when we talk about racial wealth gap in this country.
Yeah, I think you kind of said it better than I could. And I think the video you showed also illustrated it. Like there's a distinction between equality and equity. And, equality isn't enough. Like there needs to be real intentionality around like, what does equity look like in this country, right? How, like Martin Luther King said, how do you account for, no other ethnic group has been enslaved on American soil to the scale and the mass of the African American community. And so there needs to be equity, real equity, to atone and repair and rectify that crime against humanity. So I agree.
That's right. And one last one for you. This is from Roger Meadows. Thanks for the super chat. Tell them about the Freedmen's Bureau Bank, Camilla.
Oh, well, actually, AJ Plus, they have a really good educational video about the history of the Freedmen's Bank. It was there was a short, brief period of Reconstruction in this country, as you all know, right after the Civil War, the Union won. Abraham Lincoln, passed or sign legislation to create, the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Bank. It was ran by white people. They were very shoddy and essentially like stole these newly freed slaves' money. Like these people, my ancestors, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, just a quick aside, they're currently transcribing, right, documents as we speak from the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau. So if you're African American, you got to get into your genealogy, because you could find that, for instance, your ancestor or family member submitted some savings into that bank. But yeah, the bank was closed. Was closed after a number of years after infidelity. There was no FDIC at the time, for instance. And so, like our ancestors went through a lot. And so, yeah, that's the history of the bank. So yeah, Google it, look up AJ Plus. But yeah, just to conclude, there was a brief period of Reconstruction in this country. We had the Freedmen's Bank, the Freedmen's Bureau, helping newly freed African slaves transition from slavery to freedom. That was all rescinded after the assassination of Lincoln, with the emergence of Andrew Johnson. And the rest is history, with the Compromise of 1876. And so, yeah, and after that, the Republicans, made a compromise with the Democrats, not to enforce Reconstruction in the South, kind of left our ancestors for dead. And Freedmen's Bank history is kind of wrapped up in that and how it was destroyed.
That's right. And I think there's one more or two more. I think I know the answer to this. Michael, thank you for this. More, do you personally support cash reparations? I believe you do, right, Camilla?
Yeah, I do, from a scholarly perspective, in that under international human rights law, reparations come in 5 forms. And so my personal opinion is that you can't call any program for reparations unless it includes all 5 of those forms. So, yes.
That's right. And last one, thank you for this, tall girl. What are your thoughts on multi-generational Black Americans that are descendants of slaves and freedmen being its own federally recognized racial group? Interesting question.
No, that's a really interesting question. And there are people in the reparations space that have actually recently met with the Office of Management and Budget, right? They're the ones who operate the U.S. Census in this country. And there is a push to have freedmen be a category there, with the caveat that freedmen isn't a racial classification, it's a political classification. It's it's a status based on those who were descendants of slaves in this country. So yeah, to your point, there is some work to get some federal recognition or re-recognition, because it's already been recognized federally just over 100 years ago, but it never really went away. And so yeah, there is a grassroots movement to get some re-recognition of the freedman identity on a federal level, as a political status or classification rather than a racial one per se.
Well said. And I'm gonna leave you with this, Camilla. One of the questions that continues to come up as well. I know I told you last question like multiple times, but one of the questions that tends to come up as well is, what about Indigenous people? What about those who had their land stolen? What about those groups? And I've had this conversation before with the Colonized Buffalo podcast, as well as Delija, who is also Indigenous. She ran for governor in Texas as a Green Party candidate. And the response that they gave to me is that they're not asking for reparations. They're asking for something different. So what do you say? What do you say to people who ask that question? Well, what about Indigenous people as well?
Well, when I went to law school, not only did I study human rights law, so I have a Master of Laws in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam. That was through a study abroad program, but I went to Columbia Law School in New York City. And so one of my extracurricular activities, I was not only an executive board member for the Black Law Student Association. A lot of people don't know this, but I was also an executive board member for the Native American Law Student Association. And I'm not Native American, but I do consider myself to be generally an ally. And I was also interested in learning about tribal law, participated in a tribal law moot court competition, right? Because I was interested to see what are the parallels and the distinctions between these two groups. And to your point, what that person said in the podcast is what I've heard as well, where Native Americans aren't necessarily requesting or advocating for reparations, right? They're advocating for their treaty rights to be respected and enforced. They're asking for their sovereignty rights to be enforced, right? So, Native Americans, the federally recognized ones, they're considered domestic dependent nations, yet they're sovereign entities. And so that's first and foremost what they're concerned about is their sovereignty, right? Whereas the African American political project around reparations, whether people like it or not, is really about that, nearly 400 plus year political project of our citizenship rights being respected, right? In the last, 100 something years, it's about, our full citizenship rights around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment being fully respected in this country. So they're really two different political fights. So it's really a false dichotomy when people pit African American descendants of slaves and Native Americans against each other in the context of reparations. Because again, Native Americans are fighting for their sovereignty. African Americans, through reparations, are fighting for full citizenship under the law, right? That's a political project that our ancestors who were enslaved started. And so there is a distinction. I will say, though, California has a Truth in Healing Council that the governor, Gavin Newsom, signed through an executive order 2019. And so they have until 2025 to come up with reparations proposals for California natives. So, California, we're doing what we can. Like, there is no competition. There shouldn't be a competition. The last thing I'll say, though, is, right, not all Native American, tribes are the same, and we can't flatten that experience. There are some Native American tribes who actually enslaved Black people, African people, who have, were participated in slave catching, for instance, right? When we talk about the 5 civilized tribes or so, they got that identity as civilized tribes from Europeans because they participated in slavery. And if you read some books like Indian Masters, Black Slaves, you'll learn that some of these tribes were just as torturous to their African descendants slaves as white people, burned them alive and all of that. And so, history is deep, history is messy, and, it doesn't serve anyone to, flatten experiences and kind of not get into those details. So, but yeah, I'm in solidarity with the Native American community by and large, and there is no competition amongst us in terms of reparations. You can support Native American sovereignty and reparations for the African American community at the same time.
Well said. Thank you so much, Camilla. Where can people go to find you and your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Camila V. Moore, Kamilah V as in Victoria Moore. You can find me on my website, CamilaMoore.com. I have a contact page and you can reach me there as well. If folks want to learn more about the task force, they can go to our website at oag.ca.gov/AB3121. We have a meeting coming up next week. As I said, you can watch virtually or attend in person. Public comment is from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Both days, 27th and 28th. So that's a Friday and a Saturday. You can email the task force anytime with your thoughts, with your proposals. We do read the emails. You can call us as well. Our email is reparationstaskforce@doj.ca.gov. So, and you can also check out our interim report. It's, nearly 500 pages, but it's an amazing resource. And one of the task force members on our, commission, Don Tamaki, he was one of the main people responsible for helping to get Japanese Americans reparations for internment, he, has gone on to say that this report that we just released, June 2022, is the most comprehensive report on, the African American community, the contributions, and the oppression we faced since the 1968 Kerner Commission, which released a report soon after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., after the nation erupted. And so the Kerner Commission predicted that, to conclude, conditions would worsen for the African American community if there weren't some intervention from the government on this issue. And they were right, especially when we look at the reckoning that occurred in 2020 after unjust murder of George Floyd. Today, right, police have killed more people this past year than they've killed in the past 20 years. And so things have gotten necessarily worse in some instances for the African American community. African Americans in LA, right, are less likely to own a home today than they were in the 1930s. Right. So we're under this false illusion that we're in a post-racial society. When we really, unveil that curtain, you'll understand that, we still have a lot of work to do. And that's why reparations is vastly important. And that's why people need to stay engaged and support this effort.
That's right. Well, Camilla, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. All right, guys. I hope you learned a lot there. I'm going to get to some of the other super chats later on. I do want to go ahead and slide on into Louisiana here. But again, please check out the work that Camilla and the task force is doing in California. It's incredibly important. Like I said, it's not just California, but they kind of led the charge on this. But there's other cities and other states that are getting involved in this as well. But please look at what they're doing in California first, please. All right. Quick shout out to patrons, and let's move on to ballot initiatives for Louisiana. Like I said, we're only doing 3 tonight because Louisiana had a lot, and I don't want to keep you here all night. Let's just keep it real. Shout out to everyone who's a Sabby patron. Thank you so much for your support. If you're interested in becoming a patron, I have 5 categories: members, Sabbies, Sabsters, Sabinators, and of course, the ultimate. All of their names are listed here. You can also see their names going across the bottom of the screen there on the ticker. Thank you guys so much. And I know I say this all the time, but it's true. You really do keep the lights on around here. Literally all the lights that are around me right now. All right. So we're continuing our discussion about ballot initiatives. We have now made our way to the state of Louisiana. The wonderful state of Louisiana, home of jazz and gumbo and good food and good music. So we're going to dive into 3 of their ballot measures tonight. Let's go ahead and get into that. Louisiana. Now, their state is a little bit different in how it operates here with these initiatives. There are 2 ways to amend the Louisiana Constitution. One way is through a legislatively referred constitutional amendment. If 2/3, which is 66% of the members of both houses of the Louisiana state legislature vote in the affirmative, a legislatively referred constitutional amendment can be placed on a statewide ballot. If approved by a simple majority, it becomes part of the Constitution within 20 days of the election, unless the amendment itself has a different effective date provided within its provisions. Amendments to the Louisiana Constitution can be proposed that directly affect voters in just part of the state. If an amendment affects 5 or fewer parishes, it has to be approved by a majority statewide vote and a majority vote in the parishes it affects. Like I told you guys, Louisiana is a little bit different here. The same thing is true for any amendment that affects 5 or fewer municipalities in the state. Resolutions of the state legislature authorizing a proposed amendment to be placed on the ballot for voter ratification must specify an election date. The legislator can decree a special election for this purpose. Proposed amendments must cover just one subject, with the exception that the legislator is allowed to put an amendment on the ballot that, if approved, would alter or revise one full article of the Constitution. In the case of such amendment, it can cover multiple subjects. And the other way is through a constitutional convention. 2/3 of the members of both houses can call for a constitutional convention. The results of such a convention have to go before the state's voters for ratification. Unlike most other states that allow for constitutional conventions, the Louisiana legislature can directly call a convention without having to submit the question of whether or not to hold one of the state's voters. Dun, dun, dun. All right. So let's move on to the first ballot measure from Louisiana. Amendment 1, increase maximum amount invested in equities for certain state funds measure. This measure failed by 64.11%. A yes vote supported amending the state constitution to increase the portion of certain state funds that can be invested in stocks from 35% to 65%. The amendment would have increased the portion of money in certain state funds that could be invested in equities, stocks from 35% to 65%. The increase would have applied to the following funds: Louisiana Education Quality Trust Fund, Artificial Reef Development Fund, Lifetime License Endowment Trust Fund, Rockefeller Wildlife Refugee Trust and Protection Fund, and Russell Sage or Marsh Island Refuge Fund. The amendment would also have removed a provision in the Constitution that limits the legislature's ability to increase the amount of money in the Millennium Trust that may be invested in stock, and instead allows the legislator to provide for investments by general law. If any of you in the chat are in Louisiana, let me know. Give me a heads up. So Roger put a comment here. He said, honestly, the government wanted to take people's money and gamble with it in the Wall Street casino. Glad this got voted down. Also, look at that. Bipartisan support and no opposition to the amendment. So what does that tell you again? If these states want to bring in more revenue and public investments, the only way to do so is go ahead, Sabs, and finish the sentence with a what? With a public bank. So you see here, there is bipartisan support for this measure. Francis Thompson, who's a Democrat, and Jerome Zeringe, who is a Republican. So that's what Roger Meadows is pointing out there. The second initiative, property tax exemptions for certain disabled veterans and spouses measure. This is probably the fifth state that we've talked about so far that had a property tax measure on the ballot for 2022. There's something happening there. People want to say something about the property taxes. People are not happy. A yes vote supported adopting the following changes to property tax exemptions for certain disabled veterans and their surviving spouses. This passed by 72.94%. Let's go on. After the first 7,500 homestead property tax exemption, exempting the next 2,500 of assessed value from property taxes for veterans with a service-related disability rating of 50% or more, but below 70%. After the first 7,500 homestead property tax exemption, exempting the next 4,500 of assessed value from property taxes for veterans with a service-related disability rating of 70% or more, but below 100%. Exempting the total assessed value from property taxes for veterans that are totally disabled or that are 100% unemployable, and extending the property tax exemptions to the surviving spouse of a deceased disabled veteran, whether or not the exemption was claimed on the property prior to the veteran's death. Here's my take on this. I don't think this should just apply to people that served in the military and their spouses. I think everyone who falls under this category, whether they are disabled or they are a surviving spouse, should be able to have some type of property tax exemption. Because again, a lot of times people are going from two incomes to one income, and you still have the house. So you still have to pay property taxes on the house. So I wish that this was applied to everyone. You shouldn't have to be a part of the military industrial complex to get this benefit. That's my take on that. You know how I feel about that. What was interesting about this one, this is a first. No money spent against it or for it. No one against or for it. Everyone in the state must be a vet. That's what Roger Meadows put. Yeah, that is interesting. Usually there's some support here for it or against it, but unfortunately, or fortunately, that didn't happen here. And the last one I want to cover tonight, Amendment 3, classified civil service employee public support of family members' campaigns measure. This measure failed by 67.19%. A yes vote supported allowing classified service/civil service employees to publicly support the election campaigns of individuals in their immediate family when off duty. Well, isn't this interesting? Under Louisiana Constitution, going into the election, classified civil service employees were prohibited from engaging in political activity, being a candidate for nomination or election to public office, being a member of any national, state, or local committee of a political party or fraction, and making or soliciting contributions for any political party, faction, or candidate, or take active part in the management of the affairs of a political party, faction, candidate, or any political campaign. The amendment would have amended the state constitution to allow classified civil service employees in Louisiana to publicly support the election campaigns of individuals in their immediate family when off duty. And there's a lot more there. This goes pretty deep. I don't have time to read all of this tonight. I'm just being honest with you. But I can also share this with you in the chat as well. So those are the three that we're going to cover tonight. And then tomorrow we'll pick up some more. This is going to go 3 nights because Louisiana has so many of them. It's crazy. But yeah. All right. Thank you for the super chat, Bryant. Got my popcorn ready. Let's go, Sabby. Thank you for the super sticker, James Starks. Thank you for the super chat, Delthea. There are affirmative action, the program, and AA, the practice. The program was set up to mess up. However, the practice of reaching out, lifting up, and making extra effort to include people does work. Well said there, Delthea. Thank you for the super chat, Marquis. Bernie has always been a war hawk and pro-Israel propagandist since becoming a congressman. Well, damn. I wouldn't be surprised if Israel helped him get and keep his spot. Oh, Marquis, the words you were saying there. Thank you for the super chat, Soli. This is nice. Thank you for this. Can you also invite Yvette Carnell, Antonio Moore, or Dr. Sandy Darity on to discuss this topic also? I can. Thank you for the super chat, Carrie. If all Americans own the utilities and natural resources like oil and trees, not just the Rockefellers, we can end poverty and fix reparations. Interesting. And thank you for this super chat, Yonia. Thank you so much. Wow. Being a descendant of a Native American in Ados, I can attest that the unequal opportunity race is real. I also have a Rossit German Irish blood in me. I was medically kidnapped from my mother at 1 month old. Oh, wow. I'm sorry to hear that. Flamenco, the whole thing down. I'm sorry to hear that, Yonia. But thank you so much for that. Interesting. All right. We are moving on to our next story here. Bernie Sanders had an interview recently with Chris Hayes on MSNBC about working class and what people need if you are a part of the working class. Now, this may sound repetitive to many of you because we've heard Bernie Sanders make these statements before. But I want to point out something in this particular interview. because there is something that I did notice in this conversation. Let's go ahead and get into it. Shout out to Case Study QB for this clip. Let's dive right in. Here we go.
Welcome. Senator, I want to start with the history here. I think when you look in retrospect at the recovery from the great financial crisis, that period of austerity and enforced spending cuts, the sequester after 2011, really did appreciably hurt the recovery, hurt working people, hurt wage growth and job growth during that period. Are you thinking about that as you think about this next year?
The answer is yes. And what I'm also thinking about, Chris, is we live in a moment in history where we have more wealth and income inequality in America today than perhaps ever in the history of this country.
I told you, repetitive. He's saying the same thing he's been saying for years. But let's go on.
People owning more wealth than the bottom half. We have a working class today where weekly wages adjusted for inflation for the average American worker is lower than it was 50 years ago. You got millions of people working for starvation wages, 10, 11, 12 bucks an hour. So clearly what we have got to do in Congress is have the courage to stand up to powerful corporate interests and their lobbyists and start working for working families, not just the 1%.
Okay, let's pause there for just a second. Let's go ahead and chime in here. So Bernie Sanders just told you we have to stand up to those corporations. People in Congress have to do that. So in that case, instead of talking to us, because we're not in Congress, let's just be real, why not have that conversation with the squad, Bernie Sanders? Why not tell them to do that? Why not push back against some of the legislation that Bernie Sanders himself has supported that contributes to the military-industrial complex, that contributes to companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Raytheon? Bernie Sanders votes along with this legislation. Most of the time, he votes along with those things that help those corporate entities that he continues to criticize. So I don't know who he's talking to anymore. I used to fall for this, right? Like I used to fall for this. I don't know who Bernie Sanders is asking to do this. Now he's having the interview with Chris Hayes saying, we have to. But there's no we. It's him. It's him and the rest of them who are actually in Congress. They have to do those things. Let's go on.
When you say the working class, how do you define that term? How do you think about it?
I think it is the vast majority of the American people, maybe significantly brown and black disproportionately, but it is tens and tens of millions of people. And I got to tell you something, Chris, we don't.
Pause. Let's go back just a little bit here. Something he said right about here.
I think it is the vast majority of the American people, maybe significantly brown and black disproportionately.
Vast majority of the American people, specifically brown and black people, disproportionately. So Bernie Sanders is acknowledging that, but yet at the same time, Bernie Sanders did not support policies that would specifically target black communities and brown communities. Let's go with black communities because that's what I am. Bernie Sanders did not support any type of policy that was only to help Black Americans. And what do I mean by that? Bernie Sanders was against reparations for African Americans, but Bernie Sanders supported reparations for his people. And I've talked about that before multiple times on this show. That is a problem. And more people need to call that out. So why was that okay? Why was it okay for him to support it for his people, but not for African Americans? Now, this is not to say that Bernie Sanders is racist. Obviously, I think that's ridiculous. But what it is to say is that Bernie Sanders still had this belief, and you just heard from Camilla at the beginning of this show. Bernie Sanders still has this belief that by implementing these universal programs, that is going to help everybody get on the same level And it does not help everybody get on the same level. Yes, everybody needs health care. Yes, universal pre-K could help everybody who has kids to have that opportunity so they don't have to pay for that. Yes, those things do help. Free public college does help. But even when you have those programs, Black people are still going to be behind because of the lack of generational wealth and because of the fact that we did not get the 40 acres and a mule that we were promised. Camilla and I, we just went through all of this, all the history of it. So he acknowledges to you that it is disproportionately Black and brown communities, but he does not support the projects, the principles, the policies that specifically target those communities only. We have to point this out. And I know people have brought this up before when he ran again in 2020, but I want you to really understand what Bernie Sanders is saying here. Doesn't mean he's a bad person, but it does show that there is a blind spot. Let's go on.
But it is tens and tens of millions of people. And I got to tell you something, Chris. We don't talk about those people anywhere near enough. We don't talk about the fact that life expectancy for working class people is going down. And the gap between how long wealthy people live and working people live is just very, very wide. We don't talk about the fact 85 million Americans have no health insurance. People can't afford prescription drugs. And I think we have got to start focusing on the majority of the American people are working class, middle class, lower income people. It is.
When are we going to start doing that, though? See, this is the thing. Like, who's the we? Because people who are already working class, they know these things. What are they supposed to do? People who are poor, they already know they can't afford these things. They know that if you don't have health insurance, you know you don't have it. If you know you can't afford health care, you know you can't afford it. So again, who's the we? Let's go on.
It's quite unbelievable. You got 18 million families in America who spend 50% of their limited incomes on housing. How do you survive on that? How do you survive on $14 an hour? Those are the issues we got to start focusing on.
But at the end of the day, even Bernie Sanders is going to tell you to vote for his corporate Democrat opponent who is against helping those people. So how are we supposed to get working class people? How are we supposed to give them a better life? How are we supposed to give poor people a better life? How are we supposed to get people out of poverty if every time that Bernie Sanders runs, he tells you, yeah, just go ahead and support Joe Biden, support Hillary Clinton, support the same corporate Democrat that I told you to fight against? How are those people supposed to get out of their situation if you continue doing the same thing? You continue to revolve in this never-ending cycle. How's that supposed to change? This is why I tell people to focus on what you can do on the local level. You get more opportunities there. I've seen it in my state, in Massachusetts. There's a lot more that has been done here. Some of the progressive policies that Bernie Sanders has run on the national level, we've already passed in Massachusetts. It's already been implemented. I think this is where the focus needs to go. See what you can do on the local level, because let me tell you, until you get corporate money out of electoral politics on the national level, this is not going to change. They'll give you a little book. Look, during a pandemic, they still couldn't give everybody health care. Does that make sense to you? You had hundreds and thousands of people in this country dying, and your politicians in DC still didn't want to give you health care. They couldn't even give you the $2,000 stimulus check that they promised to give you during the pandemic. Let's go on.
I want to follow up on something you just said, because this is something I've been really focused on recently. Many of the trends you're describing, whether it's wage stagnation or growing inequality, are true for decades, right? They sort of can move up and down depending on what's going on at that period, but the general trends. One of those, though, is a product of 2015 on, and that's the drop in life expectancy. The U.S. is undergoing a drop in life expectancy, particularly disproportionately located in working and poor folks. That's basically unlike anything. I mean, the COVID is a huge part of that. We've seen it in other rich countries, but what's happening in the U.S. is unlike anywhere else. And it strikes me as bizarre that this central statistical fact about the country isn't an urgent matter of policy debate in Washington across the political spectrum.
It was an urgent matter of policy debate, Chris Hayes, but people like you and Rachel Maddow and all the commentators on The View and the commentators on CNN heavily smeared these policies, starting with 2015. You see, Chris Hayes was part of the problem. People like him, they heavily smeared these policies. It wasn't just people like, oh, it was just Fox News. No, bullshit. Liberal media did it too. Because see, even liberal media doesn't want that kind of information to get out to the masses. They don't want the American people to really wake up and say, wait a minute, I'm really being screwed by the top 1%. Why am I putting up with that? They don't want people to get that message and get riled up. And when you saw the thousands and thousands of people that came out to support Bernie Sanders, I'm talking about the fact if you go to a Bernie Sanders rally and you have 10,000 people there, that is not what they wanted to happen. So every time these policies came up, people like Chris Hayes, especially Medicare for All, people like Chris Hayes were like, they're going to take your health insurance away. All of them said it. Even Pete Buttigieg said it, even though he had said he was supported Medicare for All at the beginning of his campaign and then changed his mind as it got closer to the debates. Oh, I remember. Even Kamala Harris, she was another one who flip-flopped because she knew the establishment did not want that. They knew that Big Pharma did not want that. So it's funny to me that Chris Hedges is sitting here saying, why wasn't this a part of a big national discussion debate? It was a part of the discussion, but people like you smeared it over and over and over again. So the fact that he's even presenting this now is like, oh, this is something new. This should happen. This is a new idea. It's laughable to me. When I told you earlier tonight on RBN, me and JB were talking about mainstream media. I told you guys earlier tonight, mainstream media is failing, you guys. CNN just announced they're closing their headquarters in Atlanta. I've been to that headquarters. That one is huge. They are failing. And it makes me smile because that means that more people are waking up.
That people are dying earlier. That the whole point of having a flourishing society is to give people longer lives.
Chris, you're absolutely right. And you have to read my book. It's coming out in a month or so. We got several chapters on that issue.
What was that? Oh, no. You got to do what, Chris?
To give people longer lives.
Chris, you're absolutely right. And you have to read my book. It's coming out.
Read my book. Buy my book. If you want more information about this, go buy my book. You see how this works?
Out in a month or so. We got several chapters on that issue. But here is the point. How does it happen that despite spending almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as the people of other industrialized nations, our life expectancy is lower and getting worse? And as you point out, it is getting.
You know the answer to that question, though. Bernie Sanders knows the answer to his own question. Why is he asking Chris Hedges? Chris is not, or not Chris Hedges, excuse me, Chris Hayes. Chris is not in Congress.
How does it happen that despite spending almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as the people of other industrialized nations, our life expectancy is lower and getting worse?
Because we don't have universal health care for everyone in this country, Bernie. Bernie Sanders knows this. He knows that the food is worse now. He knows that the quality of life is lower because we have large poverty in this country. Bernie Sanders knows this. He sounds like he's trying to run another campaign. Buy my book.
And as you point out, it is getting really bad for low-income and working-class people. And what the doctors tell us, and I've studied this issue a bit, is we're looking at what they call diseases of despair. When people are going nowhere in their lives, they can't afford health care and education, their kids are worse off. they turn to drugs, they turn to alcohol, they turn to even suicide.
Because poverty is stressful. Being poor is stressful. Surprise. Being poor is stressful. It can be depressing. Yes, it can put you in a state of despair. It's stressful not knowing if you're going to be able to pay your rent next month. It's stressful not knowing if you're going to have heat next month because you're behind on the heat bill the month before because you couldn't pay that one. It's stressful nowadays, especially going to the grocery store and paying $9 for a carton of eggs. It's stressful trying to ration your gas just so you can get to work. And that was before inflation. If you were already poor, you were already dealing with these types of struggles. And then you add inflation on top of it. So yes, it's stressful.
So you're right. This is an issue of enormous consequence, which we should be discussing and working on a lot more.
Is there a single policy you can imagine improving life for folks, working people in this country in the year 2023 that could pass the Republican House?
I would hope, I've seen polls where Republicans regard the high cost of prescription drugs as a major, major concern.
Let's reframe the question. Listen to what he says.
Discussing and working on a lot more.
Is there a single policy you can imagine improving life for folks, working people in this country in the year 2023 that could pass the Republican House?
I said reframe it because what about the Democrat House? Yes, the Republicans have the House now. But the same policy that Chris Hayes is referring to, it won't pass the Democrat House. Let's be real here. Why have they not voted on the Medicare for All bill that Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal created? Why? Because according to Ro Khanna, they don't have the votes. And that was under the Democrat House. When I interviewed Ro Khanna, the House was Democrat majority. And he said it would not pass. So here's Chris. You see what the liberal media is doing? This is Chris Hayes saying, is there any policy that can help working class people that the Republicans in the House would actually pass? But Chris Hayes didn't ask this question when the Democrats had the House, because Chris Hayes already knew the answer. It wasn't going to pass the Democrat House either. So he should reframe the question. The way that he should have asked this question was, is there any policy that's going to benefit working class people that can pass a Democrat or a Republican House? You see how they frame the question? So the average viewer who was watching this is like, damn, those Republicans are not going to really don't like working class people. It's because of those Republicans in the House that these items are not going to get passed to help out the working class people, not even thinking about the fact that those items wouldn't get passed through a Democrat majority House either.
I would hope, I've seen polls where Republicans regard the high cost of prescription drugs as a major, major concern. I would hope that Republicans and Democrats could come together to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry, who in some cases are charging us 10 times more for the same exact drugs as sold in Canada and other countries.
But Bernie Sanders already knows that the Republicans and the Democrats are not going to have bipartisan support over that because, one, there are Republican politicians that are in bed with Big Pharma, and there are Democrat politicians that are in bed with Big Pharma. They have the same donors. Blue Cross Blue Shield doesn't just donate to the Republican Party. They donate to the Democrats too. Same with United Healthcare. Same with Cigna, Aetna, all of them. So Bernie Sanders knows this, you guys. This is why this drives me crazy. He knows damn well that the majority of those politicians in DC are in bed with Big Pharma, and that is why that Medicare for All bill will not pass in the House. So why is Bernie Sanders sitting here and trying to gaslight the American people and to make them think that somehow the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have bipartisan support over this type of issue when he knows that is not the case? It's not supported by both parties. There are a few people in the Democratic Party that do support that Medicare for All bill. The majority don't.
I would also hope that while I know we're not going to pass a Medicare for All system, which I would like to see, at least maybe we could expand primary health care all over this country so that every American can get to a doctor when he or she needs to do that.
All right.
This is a damn shame. So that every American can get to a doctor when they need to. Wasn't it just announced today that Joe Biden is sending another package to Ukraine? All the money going out the door to to people in another country. They've given them packages that include healthcare and clean drinking water. But they can't give us that. Do you guys see the problem? Bernie Sanders won't mention that, though. What I just said, Bernie Sanders isn't going to mention that in that interview. You know why? Because Bernie want to keep his seat. I'll take those comments on Rockfin, Eric. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, JVB. Thank you so much, says Sabby kicks it off. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Dave Burt. Propers to Sabby for keeping things moving, lively, and covered. Every base, first, second, third, home plate of the 411 represented. Thank you so much for that. Thanks so much. Deneen says Flint doesn't have clean drinking water. It's just, look how long it took for them to help people in Jackson, Mississippi. Angela says, I see the problem. More importantly, I see solutions that could be implemented if we didn't live in an oligarchy. That's right. I feel you. Thank you for the super chat. Yonaya says, surviving the odds, one victory at a time. Thank you for the super chat, Loco Cola. Thank you very much for this conversation. I look forward to closely following the progress this makes. Thanks for the super sticker, Sweltermate. Thank you. And thank you for this, Lawrence. Bernie is a schmuck. Thank you for the super sticker, Aberdeen71. And thank you for the super chat, Louise Brooks. I believed in Bernie. He is a sheepdog for BC. I think you mean for the DNC. He is a sheepdog for the DNC. Shameful. I feel you, Louise. And I'll take that other comment on Rockfin, Eric. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Roger. People are not waking up, Sab. They're dying of old age, and those that are left have left TV media. I don't mean to be crass, but their audience is shrinking due to nature. If you've seen that MSNBC video I sent you guys, that video from Chuck Todd, that's what it is. Working on a lot more if you still believe in Dems and the national strategy. Just know everything's been put on hold for 2 years. Interesting. Well said. Thank you so much for that, Roger. Afeni. Flint doesn't have clean drinking water, neither does DC, Baltimore, and many other sacrifice zones around this country, 100%. Baltimore was another one that had a water situation, actually not too long after Jackson, Mississippi. All right, I do see my guest is here. Kshama, if you're ready, just give me a thumbs up whenever you're ready to go. Okay, cool. All right, guys. Surprise guest tonight. Surprise. Hello, Kshama. Welcome back.
Hi, Sabby. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming back. So for those of you who are not aware, my guest tonight is Kshama Sawant. She is the city councilor of Seattle. She's also an activist. She's been on here before. And so originally, Kshama, I was already set to do a story about your response to AOC, about how she has pretty much like abandoned the workers. And I'll still show parts of that while you're here during your interview. But then I saw there's an announcement that came out about you. So I want to share this headline with everyone. Now, at first, when I saw the headline and it said Sawant won't seek re-election, I got a little nervous, but then I continued to read and it says plans to launch national labor movement. So Kshama is here tonight. Please, please, please tell us so much about this.
First of all, yeah, thanks for covering this, Sabby. I think this is extremely important. And as the headline suggests, and as the op-ed that I wrote in a local newspaper, The Stranger, which I hope your viewers are able to check it out, what we're saying is that the way we have used our office, our Socialist City Council office, for now almost a decade. When I leave this office in December, it will be a full decade that I will have been in office. We have won 4 elections, and we have won incredible victories, like making Seattle the first major city to win a $15 an hour minimum wage. We won the Amazon tax, taxing big corporations to fund affordable housing and Green New Deal programs. And we have won a whole host of unprecedented renters' rights victories. And we have done all this only because we adopted a fighting and movement building strategy for our office, unlike the well-meaning maybe, but ultimately go along to get along politics that you see even, unfortunately, from the squad in the Democratic Party establishment. And we want this message that when we fight, we can win. And also, there is no way to win without fighting. That message, we want that to be shared nationally. And that is why we feel that, and when I say we, I mean Socialist Alternative. As you know, we are a democratic organization. Our members discussed this, and we collectively decided that it's important for us to launch a national campaign and really a movement. And as we've said, it's Workers Strike Back. And I just wanted to clarify, I don't know, some of the headlines call this a new labor movement. I want to be very clear. We're not here to replace the labor movement. What we are here to do is share our message about a fighting strategy and the need for rank and file members of the union movement, and also non-unionized workers, young people who want to fight against the climate catastrophe, to defeat big business, to win Medicare for all. How do we win all this? It is through this kind of strategy, and we want Workers Strike Back to empower working people nationally, including in Seattle. And so that's why we're going to have a launch of Workers Strike Back in many cities across the nation on March 4th. And I really urge everybody to sign the petition if you go to workersstrikeback.org.
Awesome, Kshama. Now, this comes about at a perfect time because I did see that a lot of us did see this video, a viral video from AOC, where she was basically making excuses as for why they're not fighting for concessions. She said that they do fight for concessions, but privately. I'm like, okay, whatever. But you had responded to her, and you said AOC recently claimed she couldn't fight against Democratic leaders on behalf of workers because it would cause relational harm with those party leaders. What about the vast and real harm taking place in the absence of such a fight for working people? And that was a retweet of this statement here. It says, working people asked AOC, why didn't you and the squad use hashtag force the vote? The right-wing Freedom Caucus did. AOC's response, if we were to fight for something, we'd cause relational harm with the Democratic establishment. So we don't fight for anything. And I want to show people just a snippet of that really quick so people can see what Kshama is referring to
why don't we do
here.
this? First of all, there's a lot of cost and dysfunction. Second of all, those people who are holding out right now, they may have made certain structural gains, but they have also made incredible reputational and relational harm within their caucus. And so if you are trying to get something done within your caucus moving forward, you still need members of your caucus. And that at the core is an element of electoral politics that is simply inescapable.
So Kshama, I have to hear your take here about her basically just saying that like the reason why they didn't do those, they didn't force a vote, so to speak, is because of basically they didn't want to harm their reputation, it seems like.
Yeah, I think this was actually very useful that AOC said this, because it's, I think, more on, I mean, I completely disagree with her, but I think it's more clearly explaining what's going on here. What is the difference between, for example, how we ran our office and have run our office for nearly 10 years and the squad. And many people would like to draw the conclusion that, well, you know, it's easier to win at the city council level, it's harder in Congress. And no doubt you have much darker forces arrayed against you in Congress, and the stakes are higher, certainly. But I don't think there's any fundamental difference there with in that way. That there is a fundamental difference in the way we have run our office and the way the squad has approached this. And that's what she just said is going to the heart of that, where if you prioritize your relationships with the Democratic establishment, then you will sell working people out. There is no universe where you can keep the powers that be happy with you and also win something meaningful for workers. It simply doesn't happen, precisely because of the way capitalism is structured. You know, capitalism has opposing class interests. The capitalist class and their political servants have some interest, but they are directly opposed to working class interests. So when the working class wins something like what we have won, which is the $15 an hour minimum wage or the Amazon tax, it will make big business and billionaires like Jeff Bezos angry. And if you prioritize, or if it's important to you that those powerful people like Nancy Pelosi not be angry with you, then it will keep you from fighting for ordinary people. It ultimately means that you will not deliver on Medicare for all. You will not deliver on $15 an hour or anything meaningful for working people. And she says that, well, we won some things, but those are marginal, at the margins. You know, you have to talk about what's actually making a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, and some of the things that she discussed that they won, it seemed like those were things that benefited them. Like we won some committee assignments, we won some seats here and there. And like, that's not what is really helping us per se. And for people who have been claiming that the Freedom Caucus didn't really win anything, I want to share this clip here from Case Study QB, because he actually had a clip here about Kevin McCarthy cut a deal with the Club for Growth to stay out of GOP open primaries. Now, this is one of the concessions that was made by the Freedom Caucus.
He has also cut a deal with the Club for Growth to stay out of open primaries so that more of them can be elected next year. He is doing the opposite of what Mitch McConnell and sane Republicans want, which is grow their majorities next year. He has also cut a deal.
So you see, Kshama, like this is a big part. I feel like this has been misrepresented, some of the concessions that they have won, because that's huge. Like something like that, if that would have been on the Democratic Party side, that actually could have helped someone like Nina Turner, because we saw what happened to Nina Turner that last election that she had. All that big money came in at the last minute. It's like, why is it the squad could have done something like that and used that against Hakeem Jeffries, because he actually created a pact to stop other progressives from getting into Congress. But they do nothing. They vote along with it. They fold their hands and throw their hands up in the air, and they don't take tough questions from people either.
Yeah, and in fact, we just heard also, and I think others on RBN covered this, the judge that the New York State governor is promoting, you know, Hakeem Jeffries is supporting me. He's that guy is anti-abortion, anti-worker, anti-poor, and so here you go. All over again, you see the candidate that the leader, so-called leader that the squad ended up supporting, is actually supporting very reactionary interests. And yeah, I mean, if you had seen the squad actually do anything like force the vote, it would have made a huge difference in how we would have set ourselves up for some kind of meaningful victory. And when Socialist Alternative was advocating for force the vote, we made it very clear it wasn't only about forcing the vote. Now, it was partially about that, because part of their job, in our view, if you're going to actually fight for working people in Congress, part of your job is to force votes, to expose the Democrats, because there's a whole range of Democrats who want to pretend that they may be on the side of working people, maybe they're supporting Medicare for all, but they never want to be put to the test, because they also at the same time want to assure the big money interests like the insurance and pharma industries that, don't worry, we're not actually going to let anything happen. So, they keep working people in limbo like this, where you think that they might be on your side, but they're never actually doing anything for you. So part of the purpose of exposing the Democrats and forcing the vote is to force them out in the open, so that working people know these people actually voted against Medicare for all. So there's a real recognition. So educating the working class about the real role of the Democratic Party is part of your job if you get elected as a left candidate. But we always said it was not just about the vote. It was alongside forcing the vote, the squad should have called for force the vote rallies across the nation for Medicare for all. Far from calling for such rallies, using their platform, using their millions of followers on Twitter to actually mobilize people into action. I don't know if they even attended Medicare for all rallies at that time, when Force the Vote on the left was doing that. I went to Medicare for all rallies. I spoke there. I didn't see any of these Congress members there. And we have to be clear, part of the sinister consequences of the left not really having a leadership fighting for our side, fighting for working people, is that it then leaves a vacuum for the far right to come and pose as saviors of workers. I mean, yes, the Freedom Caucus actually one of the things that you mentioned, the left should have fought for it, keeping the super PACs, big money PACs out of elections. Another thing was 72 hours to read any bill. These are actually something that the left should have fought for. But to be clear, for the most part, this is a dangerous development that the far right, the right wing, is getting any kind of credence here. It's like the senators, like Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, completely disingenuously voting in favor of the paid sick leave for railroad workers while knowing that the bill is going down in flames in the Senate. Why did that happen? Because the Democratic Party and the left inside the Democratic Party has created that room for them. And it's not only the squad, let's be clear, it's Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and the entire Progressive Caucus. They are 100 strong. What are they doing there? They say they're progressives. What are they doing?
Well said. And I want to go back to this clip really quick, because there's a little bit more that she says here. And Eric, go ahead and boost this if you can.
Faction that is in a lot of trouble moving forward, including despite having made certain structural gains. So a lot of people, I mean, this was like very bloody. Like, think of it like a really bloody bar fight. Like, no one comes out with all their teeth, without any broken noses, with everyone has had some blood drawn, and we haven't even been sworn in yet, as opposed to the Democratic caucus. Now, the strength here, when you are in a minority, the play here is to be united as much as possible, because if you don't have people who break, then you can pick off the other side with just a matter of a handful of people. So as long as Democrats don't remain united in a minority, then all the votes you need to win on a certain thing are, depending on how a margin is, 3, 4, or 5. And people say Lauren Boebert has more spine than you. Lauren Boebert won her race by 500 votes. Lauren Boebert took a Trump plus 9 district and nearly lost it to an up and coming Democrat as an incumbent member of Congress.
to that point, Kshama, I will say that actually works out more in Lauren Boebert's favor, because I know Lauren Boebert's race was really close this time around. But even though her race was really close and she almost lost that election, she still was willing to go in and push back and say, no, I'm not going to vote for Kevin McCarthy unless he gives us these concessions.
I know, exactly. I mean, it's a sorry state of affairs for the American left in terms of the absence of leadership. I'm not talking about ordinary people. Ordinary people, millions of working people are ready to fight. What's missing is the leadership, the fighting strategy that we need. And it pains me to see that someone like Lauren Boebert actually, she's on the far right. Her agenda is not, I don't mean her personally only, but the far right's agenda is to try and dismantle workers' rights. The case in the Supreme Court, that is something that they're going to support, ending really negatively impacting the right to strike, Social Security, Medicare, all of the gains that workers have won from the past. We better be alarmed at the opening that the right wing is getting. I mean, it is frightening echoes of Trump himself winning his election. But exactly to your point, I mean, imagine if someone on the left had closely won their election and then had the courage to openly defy the leadership of this corporate party and demand something and win something. That is what the Freedom Caucus did. But what's unfortunate for working people is that the right wing, they are not on our side. We have to be clear and not have any illusions in them. But talk about the strategy of defying the leadership that is not on the side of working people. Who if you claim to be on the side of working people, then you have to defy the leadership of a party that is not on the side of working people. So when AOC talks about being united, I mean, it's I'm not surprised to hear her say this, but it's also just stunning that and it really pains me, because unity with whom? Unity with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin and Hakeem Jeffries? No, that kind of unity is corrosive to the interests of working people. And so you should, you should wear your defiance of those people as a badge of honor. And as far as, when AOC is talking about winning close elections, I would say that if you are a progressive, if you say you're a progressive and you're winning your re-elections handily, then you are doing something very wrong. Because I can promise you, if you are fighting for working people, let alone actually winning something for working people like we have, then expect every re-election campaign to be a massive fight. We have won 4 elections in Seattle, but we have never coasted to victory. And that is not because we don't know how to fight. That's because we are so effective in winning for working people and mobilizing working people that we are always a threat. We are always a thorn in the side of the Chamber of Commerce and the powers that be. That is why they unleash millions of dollars and all kinds of lies. They have used all kinds of attacks, lawsuits, false ethics complaints against us. They have used everything against us to try and defeat us. And you saw they tried a recall against us also, and we defeated them. And when she was, AOC was talking about close elections, it actually reminded me of the New York Times. After we won our 2019 election, we defeated Jeff Bezos' millions of dollars and won. That was our 3rd election victory. And the New York Times asked me something like, they said something like, how do you feel about the election that you nearly lost? And I said to them, you have a funny way of describing how I won the election. So ultimately what counts is who won. And if you won by defeating all the forces against you, then it shows that you are mobilizing working people and you're actually fighting for them. And, just to quote one of the lobbyists for the corporate landlord, industry, a few years ago when he retired, he spoke more honestly when he retired. And he said that really all the lobbying that the corporate landlords did of city council Democrats, all of it was a waste, because it couldn't withstand what he called his quote, Sawant's army. Sawant's Red Army. What that means, what he's referring to is the fact that it's not just me, but I've used my office to help mobilize working people, renters to come into City Hall and build movements. That is what's a real threat to the establishment.
Well said. She also went into some details here. I'm going to go to a different video here. She also went into some details here about the numbers, apparently. So let me go ahead and start this. This is where she's asked the question.
Negotiate to get concessions. We do all the time. But what we don't do is bring them publicly in order to empower not just Republicans, but the fascist flank of the Republican Party. And ironically, a lot of the concessions that Kevin McCarthy, in nature, they're not the same ones, of course, but the nature of some of these concessions actually do overlap with some of the concessions that have been the subject of private negotiations on the Democratic side. We have also negotiated for certain budgetary, we have negotiated for certain budgetary rules. We've negotiated there have been negotiations around committees, budgetary rules, and very similar kind of scopes and areas.
But nothing for the American people, though, Kshama.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, even the ones that she says that she doesn't disagree with some of the things that the Freedom Caucus ended up winning as concessions. She says that, they have been the topic of private negotiations within the Democratic Party leadership. So that's the whole question. So if there are things that you agree with, then why did it take the right wing to launch an all-out fight against the powerful people in their party? Why didn't you use that? So clearly, it sure tells you that private negotiations don't work. And another thing we have to be very clear about. She said that, this kind of open battle inside the Republican Party, that's actually bad for the Republican Party. Obviously, it shows a crisis inside the Republican Party, yes. But what she is maybe out of touch with or not willing to admit on camera is that overall, what we're seeing is a crisis of both parties where they have lost touch with the lives of ordinary people. The establishment of both parties are completely out of touch with ordinary people's lives. And that is what's creating a room for this. If she is worried about the far right, then the unwillingness of the squad to fight back is helping to create more and more of that vacuum that the right wing is occupying. So if we, as progressives, as people on the left, as young people, if we are worried about the right wing having more of an echo, more of a current in American consciousness, then the only way to defeat that is to build a stronger left. And in fact, to the extent that they have any opening, it's because the Democratic Party is widely understood as a party of Wall Street. That's the problem. That is the very problem. And so the job of the progressives in the Democratic Party is not to give cover to the corporate establishment in their party. Their job is to expose them. And yes, it is absolutely about having a public fight. So as long as the squad are unwilling to expose the leadership of the party, they are going to end up automatically giving cover to the party. Whether they say something or not, the fact that they're not willing to fight means that they are giving cover to the Democratic Party establishment. And it's unfortunate that most of the sections of the DSA leadership have been unwilling to hold the squad accountable. So it's like a pipeline of a lack of accountability. DSA leadership refuses to hold the squad accountable. The squad refuses to hold Pelosi and Biden accountable. So ultimately, who's benefiting? Not working people. It's big business. That's how the railroad workers were sold out.
100% agree. And I think some people may forget this, but the whole point of Justice Democrats was to do everything in their power to push back against the establishment. Democrats in DC, they were not supposed to join them and become their buddies. They were supposed to go there and implement a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party. I remember when this was advertised, that was the whole point of Justice Democrats. So when you hear people like AOC say, well, we can't because of reputation and certain relationships with people. What happened with the Freedom Caucus was a bloody, fight. That right there lets you know that she's not going to fight back. She's not going to push. And I think more people are waking up to this now, Kshama, since the railroad workers' inability to strike. So I think more people are waking up to it now. But even after the way that they treated Nina Turner, refusing not to endorse her, AOC deciding to endorse her the night before last minute, which was also performative, everything that has happened up until this time, starting with Force the Vote, it's really interesting to me. It took the railroad worker trying to strike for a lot of people to really wake up. And I'm talking about people that I know that are like AOC or squad stands. That was the breaking point for a lot of those people. And I really wonder, like, what else is it going to take? Because there's no point, and this is the point I try to drive home to people. There's no point of even trying to put progressives through the Democratic Party anymore because they're just a part of the corporate establishment now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why Socialist Alternative has said repeatedly, and we'll be saying through our worker strike back work as well, that we need a new party for working people. It's not working. And, and we have to understand both things. Like, on the one hand, we have to be very clear that electoral politics is not where the biggest gains for working people will be won. What we really need is mass struggle based, nationally, not just in one city. But at the same time, those struggles will be a non-starter if we are not clear, if working people are not clear that the Democratic Party is not on our side, and we need our own political organizations, our own parties that will fight for us, where we can hold our leadership accountable, where the elected representatives from that party, like me, are going to take only the average worker's wage and remain part of not only the party but its elected representatives, both remain in touch with the working class and remain part of social movements, just as my office has been. And let's be clear, if AOC or the members of the squad were to wake up tomorrow and decide that they want to fight, they will be welcomed with open arms. I will be rejoicing if they were going to do that. But at the same time, I think we also have to be sober. And as you said, Sabby, they haven't done that so far. In fact, the railroad workers' betrayal by them was I think it has been understood by more people than Force the Vote was. I think a lot of people are clear that that was a betrayal, that was a breaking of the strike. And so I don't think that we can, we can harbor illusions in them. We have to take the message that actually we do need to fight back in the grassroots, which is why we are launching Workers Strike Back. In reality, it should have been and I said this morning at the press conference, it should have been the leadership of the labor movement that launched something like Workers Strike Back, like the union movement in the UK launched Enough is Enough, because we need a campaign at that scale. It's a scale of hundreds of thousands in the UK. Here it should be in millions of people, proportionate with the population, but that hasn't happened, and that's another aspect of the failure of left and progressive leadership that we need to talk about. It's not only the elected representatives who have failed us. Unfortunately, a big section of the labor leadership is so tied to the Democratic Party that they are not willing to call out the Democrats. They are not willing to run independent candidates. They are not willing to use strike action boldly, mobilize the rank and file to fight for strong contracts. Unfortunately, much of the labor leadership has for decades used a strategy of what we would call business unionism, trying to make peace with the bosses while winning gains on the margins for the rank and file. That doesn't work. We need a rank and file led militant revival of the labor movement. And just to give a concrete example of what I'm talking about, right now, as we know, the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court, has chosen to hear the Glacier Northwest versus the Teamsters case. Let's be clear, this is not about any one union or Teamster local. This is the conservative Supreme Court and the billionaire bosses looking to have a precedent-setting anti-strike, anti-labor ruling because they want to go at the heart of the right to strike itself. So this is relevant to all union members and in fact to all workers as a whole, because the strike action is the only real weapon we have against capital, and we cannot afford to lose this. So why is it that it's, as far as I know, it's only Socialist Alternative and me who have called for a nationwide protest action? What we are saying is that we need a day of action outside federal courthouses where we mobilize the rank and file of the union movement. But my question is, why isn't it Liz Schuler, the head of the National AFL-CIO, who is making this call? Why isn't it the leaders of the labor movement? So this, again, it shows that we cannot wait on labor leaders. We cannot, who are tied to the Democratic Party, much less the Democrats themselves. We cannot wait on these leaders. They have failed us. And so we need the rank and file of the labor movement, rank and file ordinary people, working people, to fight back. And that's what the workers' strike back is about. And I want to be clear, it is not only, workers' strike back is not only about the union movement. So if you're watching this and you're a worker, but you're not a member of the union, it does not matter. We want you to be part of the fight back. So please sign our petition, because we need workers to fight on every level. And I'll also mention the Black Lives Matter movement is another example. We had the largest street protest movement in US history after George Floyd was murdered. But the gains of the movement, as many young people have recognized, were in no way proportionate to the scale of the movement. Again, that's not a failure of ordinary people. It shows you that social movements also need leadership who are accountable, principled, and who don't become part of the cozy club at the top, but are actually willing to put themselves on the line to win something meaningful.
100%. And I want to show everyone the demands here. This is Workers Strike Back. And here are some of the demands. Workers need a real raise, good union jobs for all, fight racism, sexism, and all oppression, quality, affordable housing, and free healthcare for all. And I like the fact that you have this here, Kshama, the healthcare, because again, still advocating for everyone to have healthcare, but it's not attached to a political campaign. I think that's incredibly important. And also, no more sellouts. We need a new party. This is something that I think, and Eric, thank you so much for putting the link to the site in the chat. This is something I think, Kshama, that people, a lot of us in the progressive movement expected Bernie Sanders to do. But did not happen. So I really, really appreciated this. Thank you so much. And then here is the petition. Eric, can you put the link to the petition in the chat so people can sign? If you agree with our demands, sign our petition. Well said. Well said. I'm glad that this is happening, Kshama. One thing I will ask, because I know this question is coming up as well. I think Case Study QB's in the chat. He just asked this question. Thanks for the super chat, Case. Will a socialist run to replace you on the council?
Well, for Socialist Alternative, it is, as I've said many times, it's for us, we engage in this question collectively and democratically. So it's never going to be about me or any other individual. And for us, the guiding principle is, what is the best way in which Socialist Alternative can use our resources to further the cause of the working class? So at this moment, we are not in a position to run a candidate. As I said, we are launching Workers Strike Back. And so the launch of Workers Strike Back is going to be in multiple cities around the nation. It's not just in Seattle. So if you live, in Boston, Minneapolis, New York, Houston, Orlando, we're going to have launch events in many cities. If you sign the petition, you will get the information. And if it's not in your city, you can, I'm sure, get on a Zoom call and remotely attend the launch of Workers Strike Back. And we really need genuine socialists to run in many cities. And we don't rule out that Socialist Alternative could run a candidate in the future. But right now, we're going to be launching Workers Strike Back. And also, I don't know if I mentioned, alongside Workers Strike Back, we're also launching a video broadcast in the summer called On Strike, where we want to discuss all these issues. And also, we're going to be on the ground when struggles break out. I mean, two very crucial struggles I hope the rank and file will take the lead on is the UPS contract renewal and the West Coast port workers contract, the longshore workers contract renewal. These are two going to be crucial battlegrounds.
100%. I'm definitely going to sign the petition. This is something I've been looking towards. I think a lot of people they're looking for something to do, Kshama. I talk to people on call-in twice a week, and I hear the same things every night, that people want something else to get involved in, to be passionate about. For a lot of people, for a while, that was union efforts. But then after seeing what happened to the railroad workers, people were also disappointed. And I think this gives people something else to fight for and not just rely on electoral politics. And that's something I push very heavily, as I'm sure you know, over here, is that you can't just, the answer can't just be get these gains through a political campaign. And I think we saw that with Bernie Sanders when the campaign fell apart. Well, it's like the demands just disappeared, and there was no leader in the movement anymore. So there has to be something else for people to get involved with and still fight for those things.
Absolutely agree.
Awesome. So, Kshama, thank you so much. I know this was mad last minute, but what advice would you give to people? I mean, other than like worker strike back, like I said, like this is phenomenal. I think this is huge. What advice would you give to people who are thinking about doing something similar to what you did? For example, running for city council. I've told people I think city council positions are heavily important because they control the budget. A lot of people are not aware of that. Running for those positions and then still being active in the community. What advice do you have for people about that? How they can still do both?
You know, I don't know if people will, those who are genuine and really want to run for office, I don't know if they're going to like to hear what I'm going to say, but I think, and it's not just my opinion, this is the experience of having been in office for a decade, and also past lessons from history, historical lessons speaking here. It's not just the opinion of an individual, that if you want to do what we have done, which is actually, like not sell out and also not be marginalized, that those are two important components, and not just be about rhetoric and ideas, but put those ideas into action and win material gains for working people. And even bigger gain that we have won is not even more than the material gains we have won, which is all very important, because people still, I was just telling another reporter today, when we won the $15 an hour minimum wage, and I would be shopping at Goodwill, the Goodwill store, or the local grocery store, literally workers have come up to me in tears and holding my hand saying, the $15 an hour minimum wage, that made all the difference to my family's life. And same with the renters' rights victories that we have won, like the 6-month notice for rent increase and so on. People come up to me and say, this has really made a difference. But even more than that, what the real gain in many ways of the reforms we have won is the increasing clarity that, first of all, what does it take to win? And it's actually possible to win. Raising workers' confidence is what we have done. But the bottom line, Sabby, unfortunately, is that if you want to do the kind of work we have done using our office, you cannot do it alone. So the reason that we have been successful, and that is why I'm using the pronoun we and not I, is because it was never just me. If it was just me, with all the good intentions and the talent and the quality that anybody might, any individual might embody, none of that is going to be enough to actually do what we have done. The reason we have succeeded is because I have had, and together we have had Socialist Alternative, which is an organization rooted in very strong scientific ideas, which in other words is Marxism, and combining that with extremely dedicated and self-sacrificing individual members who are themselves part of the working class, and then using all of that to build wider struggles of ordinary people, whether it's renters or young people fighting in BLM or against climate change, and union members. It is through all of that that we have been able to do it. And so if there's any individual who's watching this who thinks that they should run for office and do what we have done, my honest suggestion to them would be, don't, unless you have an organization with you, it's better that you join Workers Strike Back and then we actually collectively push for something. Or if there are struggles locally that are breaking out, be part of that struggle and help build those struggles, bring the fighting strategy that we have used here to bear in those struggles and win victories, because that is the only way we can progress. And really, at the end of the day, that's part of the answer to this question also is that we do need more candidates to run who will fight like I have done. But for that, we genuinely need a new party for working people, so that that party can stand behind you, stand with you, and make sure that you are not alone. You alone cannot fight the establishment.
Well said. Kshama, have you shown this to Chris Hedges yet?
We just talked to Chris Hedges today, and he said he's going to get back to us, and probably going to be on his show soon.
Awesome, because I was going to send it to him because he was just here recently and he was mentioning we should have started something for the workers a long time ago. So I know he would be pretty excited about this.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for coming on, Shauna. I really do appreciate it. Again, I know it was kind of last minute, but thank you so much. And I'll definitely fill out the petition, and I'm really excited about this.
Thank you so much, Sabby, for signing the petition and also for having me on at last minute. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Talk to you. Bye-bye.
All right, guys. If you've been looking for something to get involved in, this is the jam. Again, Workers Strike Back. We're going to talk about this tonight on Call-In. So I want to hear your takes about this again. Guys, this is not a partisan thing. It's not a partisan thing. If you're a worker, you support the workers, this is something you should get involved in. I don't want to hear, I'm a Democrat, so I can't. I'm a Republican, I can't. This is not about that. Put all that aside. Okay, just put all that aside. And let's work together. And let's get something done. Eric, I'm going to take just a really quick break, and then I'll come back, and then we'll head on over to Call-In.
All right. Let's see. All right. How's everybody doing on this Thursday night? Yes, Call-In is coming up after we give Sabby a little break here. Let me put the Call-In link in the chat again if you want to get prepared to jump in on that, which will be moving over soon. You can view or participate in Call-In on your web browser, or you can or you can install the app on your smartphone and do it that way. And hello to everyone. I'm going to get through some of these chats and super chats. We got a few built up here. Let's see. Thanks for this super chat, Luis. I'm a Washington State girl. Go Kshama. So much love. Thanks for that. Steve Wolfbrand says, I love Kshama. And thanks for that chat. Case Study QB, we did his earlier. Thanks for that super chat. All right, from Delthea, who hopefully we'll hear from later in the call-in. Wait a minute. AOC is saying that policy that helps people isn't worth hurting a politician's feelings. What the actual F? Quiet part out loud. Yes, ma'am, Delthea. And thanks for this super chat, James Starks. A true working class revolutionary. Thank you, Sabby, for exposing your viewers to a true revolutionary class activist, Kshama Sawant. Much love, all power to the people. Thanks for that, James. And thanks for this super sticker with the solidarity fist from Sam. Thanks for that. And from Colin, thanks for this super chat. Kshama is moving in the way of our black revolutionary leaders. Respect to her. Definitely agree on that. Thank you, Colin. So let's see what we've been talking about today while we give Sabby a little break, and then we'll be jumping into Call-In. Let's see. Oh, one of the things, we were talking earlier. What was our earlier story? About actually this was on RBN on a Sabby and JB show, and they were talking about Michael Eric Dyson and this whole like what they're talking about in these college it's like these highbrow college professors and talking about reading and whatnot. And I feel like at the core of it, there's this elitist mentality of that there's a certain class of people, right at the top who have a certain amount of money and learning and know the right people or in the right groups, and they're the ones in their view who should be running everything, and they're really afraid of the masses, of the peasants. And so like real democracy is actually something they're afraid of, because it means that they're not in charge. They're not the ones, calling the shots and making the decisions. And so, I mean, to me, I feel like that's at the core of a lot of this fight is this mindset with this very top, 0.1% of people in their minions, up at the 1% who support them. And so, anyway, that just occurred to me. It's a real mindset. We'll be hitting over to call in soon, and you can see the pinned chat. And then as far as whether to be doing, sometimes there's this tug of war between whether we should be doing strikes or direct actions and mutual aid versus electoral politics and whatnot. And I mean, I always say that it shouldn't be viewed as a competition. It should be viewed as we need to be doing all the things, and you need demands. Any strikes need demands, and we saw on the movement that Kshama is promoting, a definite set of demands, and it's the type of thing that I've been promoting to kind of pull everything together, is a set of demands. And if you're, so as far as like whether or not to run candidates, I feel like if you're just saying, should we run candidates, if you're not, it's kind of cart before the horse type of thing. I feel like you really need to have a mass movement happening, operating, and have those set of demands and have these things happening, and then have candidates rising out of the movements. And Kshama was saying tonight, like, just going in as an individual and just saying, running for office is going to be difficult at best. But if you're one of many candidates rising out of a movement, then that's a very different thing. And I think that's what we need to be shooting for. And we can talk about that in Kshama on call-in just about now. I'll see you in there.
That's right. All right. Here we go. We are going over to call in tonight's episode. This is episode 73. Kshama Sawant launching worker movement. Kshama Sawant has announced she is launching a worker movement. She has responded to AOC's viral video about fighting for concessions and how it relates to fighting for the working class. What are your thoughts? So that call-in link is pinned to the top of the chat. Come join me over there, guys. Great discussion. I really want to hear your take on this, especially those who want to get involved. I'll be filling out that petition after the call-in segment tonight. Quick alert, I will be on Fault Lines tomorrow morning, I think at 9. Hold on. Let me check. Sometimes I get the times mixed up. 9:15, I will be on Fault Lines tomorrow morning. So definitely check out that. And I do have some surprise announcement about some future guests that are coming up. So hopefully I'll be able to announce that tomorrow, if not tomorrow, on Sunday. So check me out then. All right, guys, let's go ahead and head on over to call in. You know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.